Cyrene's beta is long over, and there are a lot of opinions and hot takes floating around about her. I apologize that it took me a while to get this video out to give you my final conclusions, but I wanted to do a lot of testing of my own to make sure I knew exactly how I feel about Cyrene before sharing it with all of you. So with all of that said, how exactly did Cyrene turn out? Is she as bad as people are making her out to be, or have they underestimated her potential? I'll walk you through it while providing some of the numbers from all the testing I've done for Cyrene. But first, a word from the sponsor of today's video. LD Shop is a safe and reliable top-up site that allows you to buy currency across multiple different games, including Honkai Star Rail, Genshin Impact, among other games. They offer prices at a discount, from anywhere up to 13% to 25% cheaper than topping up in-game. Not only are the prices cheaper, but they make topping up completely effortless. All you need is your server and game ID, and you're good to go. No hassle at all, and no personal information required whatsoever. After purchase, you can see that the Jades are sent to my account within 5 minutes. There are no downsides to using LD Shop for your purchases, as the prices on LD Shop are strictly better than the prices in-game. But the upsides don't stop there. Users who register using my link in the description below will get an exclusive 15% and 5% coupon, which can save you up to $50. Additionally, if you spend $80 in total, you can earn an Express Supply Pass for completely free. If you want to top up at discounted prices with no downsides, using a website and method that has been approved as safe by multiple large content creators in the space, then click the link in the description below to head over to LD Shop and start saving money on your gacha game top-ups right away. For starters, it is undeniable that Cyrene has a very restrictive kit. She is a Chrysos Heir support made solely with them in mind, and her kit being incredibly hyper-specific to the point of naming each Chrysos Heir in her abilities is still a very limiting design that makes it dubious how long she'll actually last in the future, considering the chances of her getting new teammates to work with is very, very slim. None of this has changed, and it's still a very valid concern. If you're a big fan of the Chrysos Heirs, however, and you just want to be able to use them on your account for as long as possible, then that is what Cyrene is made for. Pull Cyrene if and only if you are certain you want to keep on playing the Chrysos Heirs in the future. The only question that remains is how good she is at buffing each of the different Chrysos Heirs. Each of the Chrysos Heirs have different strength levels to begin with, and Cyrene buffs each of them in different ways. So there's going to be some variance depending on who you're hoping to play her with. If you don't know what each of Cyrene's buffs do, consider watching my Cyrene First Impressions video for a basic rundown of her abilities, since her buffs mostly didn't change in terms of how they mechanically work. So to do this in the most simple way possible, let's go through each of the Chrysos Heirs, similarly to my tier list video I made before, and just discuss whether or not you should consider pulling Cyrene for them. First off, the support of Chrysos Heirs are obviously all in a weird place, where you aren't necessarily pulling Cyrene for them, but I'll still briefly touch on our synergy with each of them. Remembrance Trailblazer unlocks a pseudo main DPS playstyle when paired with Cyrene's buff, and while this playstyle is fun, it's actually not the main reason you would use these two together. What really helps RMC synergize with Cyrene is their ability to use Mem's first action advance on Cyrene in order to help manage Cyrene's ramp-up time, since Cyrene takes so long to get her first ultimate. Mem's actions are also able to give Cyrene recollection stacks unconditionally, since Mem sprites are able to give Cyrene recollection stacks without needing to wait for Cyrene to take a turn. So basically, RMC works well with Cyrene due to easing up Cyrene's ramp-up time, which is really nice if you don't have any of the other supports, since the free support, RMC, will work perfectly fine with your Cyrene team. For Tribby, there isn't any inherent synergy between Cyrene and Tribby. Cyrene's buff for Tribby only buffs Tribby's personal damage, so if you're trying to play main DPS Tribby, then go for it, I guess. While there isn't any inherent synergy between these two, however, Tribby is just such a powerful generic support, and Cyrene is a powerful support for the Chrysos Heir specifically, so when you combine these together, they end up being a pretty strong generic pairing for a lot of the Chrysos Heir teams. Before I move on to the other supports, I want to talk about the two sustains of Amphorius, Hyacinth and Danheng Permancer Terai. Hyacinth is a similar case to RMC, where even though Cyrene's buff for Hyacinth isn't the craziest thing in the world, it's mainly just an increase to Hyacinth's personal damage, which is nice but not groundbreaking. The reason Hyacinth and Cyrene synergize so well together is due to Hyacinth's ability to ease up Cyrene's ramp-up time. This is going to be a common theme among the Remembrance Path characters, due to Memesprites inherently having the ability to charge Cyrene's ultimate faster, and Hyacinth is by far the best at it, considering how many turns both she and Ika are able to take. There is a noticeable difference between the teams who use Hyacinth and the teams without Hyacinth when it comes to stacking Cyrene's ultimate. With that said, Danheng PT is obviously the free sustain option that everyone will have access to, so I don't want to sell him short, considering he will be the only Chrysos Heir sustain option for a lot of people who are considering pulling for Cyrene. While Danheng PT is just worse than Hyacinth at dealing with Cyrene's ramp-up time, as long as you're still able to get Cyrene's ultimate within the first cycle by building her with enough speed to take 3 actions in the first wave, which would require 200 speed or using Von Whack, then you won't feel the loss of Hyacinth too much. Cyrene's subsequent ultimates will still be slower, but that's just the trade-off for not needing to spend pulls on Hyacinth. But, of course, this is only for the attack scaling Chrysos Heirs. For any of the HP scaling Chrysos Heirs, such as Mighty, Evernight, or Casterus, Danheng PT is not a viable option, and thus, if you're considering Cyrene for any of these characters, but you don't have Hyacinth, you should definitely prioritize Hyacinth first, since Cyrene is not going to feel good to play without Hyacinth for these teams. But if you're not an HP scaling Chrysos Heir, then congratulations, you have a perfectly viable free sustain option. Even for some of the attack scaling Chrysos Heirs, he's not necessarily better than Hyacinth, but he will do perfectly fine. And to briefly touch upon the last two supports before we dive into the DPS characters, we have Cipher and Seridra. Cipher's buff is nice, the defense threat is great, and has the potential to scale really well in certain teams that can stack defense thread, but Cipher's best in slot teams tend to be DPSs who aren't Chrysos Heirs, such as Acheron, Faceout, and Archer. As such, the lack of a Chrysos Heir DPS on the team would obviously inherently make Cyrene less of a necessity. Seridra is the opposite of Cipher. Whereas Cipher has a decent buff from Cyrene, but has no real teams where they synergize together well, Seridra has an underwhelming buff from Cyrene, but makes up for it by actually having good teams with several of the Chrysos Heir DPSs, thus making Seridra worth using with Cyrene. Now, I will say, there are some scenarios where you don't even bother using Cyrene's buff on Seridra because you're better off continuously spamming it on the DPS instead, but even so, Seridra's synergy with the Chrysos Heir DPSs is good enough that she and Cyrene synergize very well together on the same team. We'll talk about which teams those are as we now transition into talking about the DPSs, which is the real meat and potatoes of this video. The assumptions for every team will be E0 for every character, with signature light cones on the main DPS, as well as assuming that each team is using a sustain. This is not a sustainless discussion. So, if you're an Agia main, should you consider investing in Cyrene for her? This is a tricky one, because while Cyrene is numerically a buff for Agia, the buffs she provides to Agia are seriously no joke. There are some gameplay issues between these two that makes it much less comfortable compared to Agia's current teams with Sunday, Robin, and Huohuo. For starters, you must replace Huohuo with one of the Chrysos Heir sustains to reduce Cyrene's ramp-up time. That is non-negotiable. From there, you have a few options. You see, the issue with pairing Agia with Cyrene is that they both suffer from ramp-up issues. They both have very immense energy costs, and they need the team to cater towards those energy costs if they want to do anything in a fight. Oftentimes, you'll spend the entire first cycle just whacking enemies like a wet noodle, waiting for both Agia and Cyrene to finally get their ultimates so they can pop off. You can keep Sunday on the team, which completely negates Agia's ramp-up time, but then Cyrene's ramp-up time becomes even worse due to losing a Chrysos Heir on the team, which is a straight-up -3 recollection stacks from her bonus ability. Additionally, Cyrene is already mostly able to manage Agia's ultimate uptime after the first ultimate by spamming her buff to give Agia energy, so Sunday isn't as necessary outside of the first ramp-up cycle and ends up just having less potent buffs than the likes of, say, Tribby, who you can slot in instead to help out Cyrene's ramp-up time more. But then you once again run into the issue of Agia's ramp-up time being a mess. You can use RMC as well to try and fix this, but in my experience, it's still not enough to fix both Agia and Cyrene's ramp-up times. So here's what I've found with pairing Agia and Cyrene. When you pair these two together, you often end up sacrificing the ability to clear in the very first cycle. If you do this, and you just sacrifice the first cycle to spend time ramping up both Agia and Cyrene so that you can start letting loose with the crazy Cyrene buffs in the second cycle, then from the second cycle onwards, Cyrene is Agia's best buffer by far. Thus, if your current Agia team of Sunday, Robin, and Huohuo also isn't able to clear the first wave in the first cycle, meaning you're going into the second cycle no matter what, then the Cyrene team will just win out. Here are the exact numbers comparisons that I ended up with. Since fights in Honkai Star Rail are based on action value on the action order bar instead of being based on real time, damage is measured by damage per action value instead of damage per second, but you can think of them as being similar. Cyrene was roughly a 15 to 20% increase in performance, but do note that Cyrene can be a very high skill ceiling character, and thus, her performance can soar even higher. I understand that zero cycles are all the rage nowadays, and if something can't zero cycle, then it's seen as worthless, but I think it's very relevant to mention that if your team is going to take multiple cycles anyway, then Cyrene is the best in those scenarios. However, if your current Agia team is invested enough to not get stuck on the first wave, then you can comfortably stick with your current Agia team and not miss out on too much. It should also be noted that this is mainly taking into account the performance and memory of chaos. In other game modes, such as Anomaly Arbitration, fights are generally always going to take longer, and that's where Cyrene really starts to shine with Agia over her current team options. But you know what fixes a lot of the issues I mentioned before? Agia's E1. Agia's first Eidolon fixes a lot of her own ramp-up issues, and thus, you can focus solely on dealing with Cyrene's ramp-up issues, while Agia actually gets to pop off a bit in the first cycle. All this to say, if you're an Agia main looking to upgrade her teams, Agia's E1 should still be your first priority. After that, then you can start eyeing Cyrene as the definitive best-in-slot teammate for Agia. And to briefly touch on RMC versus Tribby in the last slot for Agia and Cyrene, I understand that RMC is better for managing both of their ramp-up times since you can action advance one of them, but in a similar vein to Agia's current teams versus Cyrene, if you end up going past the first cycle anyway, then the marginally faster ramp-up time isn't the biggest deal in the world. In sustainless setups, I have no doubt that RMC is very strong for Agia, but I personally found more success using Tribby, and I can only really speak to my personal experience with testing Agia and Cyrene. So, for Agia, Cyrene is an overall increase, but her pull value for Agia is similar, if not slightly behind Agia's own vertical investment into her E1 or light cone. Once you've crossed that vertical investment line, however, then Cyrene would definitely be your next consideration for Agia. Next on the list is Mighty. Ever since Cyrene's kit was first revealed, I have been very vocal about Cyrene being the definitive best in slot for Mighty. For starters, starters, Cyrene's buff for Mighty is just deceptively good. A free Godslayer that gets 200% more crit damage compared to his normal Godslayers is crazy for Mighty. But even better is the way Cyrene allows you to control when to let loose that massive damage nuke. In addition to this, Mighty just doesn't have very many synergistic supports. He mostly just plays with the scraps of supports who are made with other units in mind, while Mighty was left behind in the dust by Hoyo. So the fact that Cyrene is a support who is finally made with Mighty in mind instantly makes her his best in slot, under a few conditions. First off, there's the Hyacinth clause. If you're going to play Mighty with Cyrene, you are heavily incentivized to run Hyacinth. This is going to be a rough first hurdle for a lot of Mighty mains, since Hyacinth on her release was not Mighty's definitive best in slot sustain in all scenarios, due to the fact that her heals were worse at keeping Mighty's HP consistently high enough for him to drain more HP from more Godslayers. However, Hyacinth is obviously the de facto best in slot sustain for Cyrene teams, and Cyrene is now the de facto best in slot support for Mighty. Therefore, Hyacinth now becomes the best in slot sustain for Mighty. As for the final slot in Mighty teams, I discussed before how Mighty was stuck using supports who don't specifically synergize with him. This refers to characters like Tribby and Seridra. Tribby is obviously just very generically strong, and she still performs well with the Cyrene team, largely in part due to her synergy with Hyacinth. Tribby plus Hyacinth will always be a strong combo in any AoE scenario, which is part of why Tribby performs so well with the Glaya for me as well when paired with Hyacinth. This is how the damage comparison looked like between Mighty's current teams and his Cyrene team. Now, to briefly touch on Seridra, the synergy between Seridra and Mighty always existed to some extent. Double Godslayers are really strong, but there were always gameplay practicality issues between these two. First of all, a large portion of Seridra's power budget is in her 1000 attack buff, which Mighty obviously can't utilize since he scales on HP. Secondly, lining up Mighty's charge to perfectly time his Godslayer to get doubled by Seridra is really difficult for most players, meaning getting the full value out of Seridra with Mighty just wasn't very practical, especially since getting hit by enemies influences how quickly Mighty gets charged. Cyrene fixes this issue since she can hold an on-demand Godslayer for Mighty, and you get to choose when to unleash it. Thanks to this, you can make sure you always time Seridra's double skill to line out with Cyrene's on-demand Godslayer for Mighty, since you can just hold Cyrene's buff until Seridra's military merit is fully stacked. This synergy makes Seridra feel way better with Mighty than most Mighty mains would probably expect. Don't get me wrong, in my testing, it wasn't a huge upgrade over Tribby, but it is a very satisfying combo that would definitely be better than Tribby in scenarios that aren't heavily AoE favored. So if you're interested in upgrading your Mighty team, I would definitely recommend looking into pulling Cyrene for him, under the caveat that you'll also want to pull Hyacinth, unless you're willing to run Mighty Sustainless, which is doable since he can taunt enemies to attack him, and he has multiple revives, so if that's what you want to strive for, then knock yourselves out. Next up is the Anniversary unit, Casterus. We've already discussed how and why Cyrene synergizes well with having other Remembrance characters on the team to charge her ultimate faster, so the fact that Cyrene inherently synergizes with Casterus' best-in-slot teammate Hyacinth already leads to some very high synergy between all of the Remembrance characters, minus Agia, of course, who you would never use in this team. Cyrene's buff for Casterus is rather interesting. First off, the ability to overcap on Nubud stacks and convert it into extra damage multipliers is just a really nice quality of life to ensure no point of healing goes wasted. The main appeal for the buff, however, is obviously the increased multiplier in 2-target or single-target scenarios. Single-target scenarios are already the type of content where Casterus struggles the most, so the fact that Cyrene is designed to help Casterus in her worst matchups while adding quality of life for overstacking Nubud at the same time is really nice. Now, what I will say is that when Casterus isn't in single-target scenarios, Tribby still competes very strongly against Cyrene for that final slot in a Casterus team. There's been a ton of discussion about who is actually better for Casterus when it comes to Tribby versus Cyrene, and whether or not Cyrene is actually worth it. From my testing, as you can see, they performed very similarly against Flame Reaver, which is a fight that can have both AoE and single-target phases, depending on when you use Casterus' dragon. I have seen gameplay of Cyrene pulling ahead against this fight, so while I acknowledge that it is technically possible, I think it's important to discuss skill ceiling when it comes to whether or not a player should consider pulling. Cyrene's kit in general needs a lot more gameplay optimization in order to make full use of it, compared to Tribby, who is incredibly set it and forget it with her permanent res pen buffs and her effortless personal damage constantly proccing. While I'm not the best player in the world by any means, I'm also not a casual player by any means. So if my gameplay results in Cyrene and Tribby performing very similarly, I think it's more than likely that Cyrene's performance could drop off even more for players who aren't able to optimize the usage of her buff for Casterus. That's why I want to be cautious in recommending Cyrene for people, because this is the case in a lot of Cyrene teams, not only Casterus teams, as we'll discuss next. When played optimally, I do think Cyrene is an overall increase for most of the Chrysos Heirs in most situations. But when you make even 1 or 2 mistakes in utilizing Cyrene's buff for the Chrysos Heirs, then their current and arguably more easier teams start to even out. Therefore, I think it's very possible that some people will pull Cyrene under the pretense that she's a straight up buff for their teams, which she generally is, but the higher difficulty in playing her might make it feel not quite as impactful as it otherwise could be. So just be sure you know what you're getting yourself into if you're interested in pulling for Cyrene. For Casterus specifically, I would only pull Cyrene if you're looking to help your Casterus in single target scenarios. When you're in AoE, Tribby is still very competitive with Cyrene, Cyrene. There's also the looming Tribby E1, which would cost the same amount of pulls as getting Cyrene for those of you who are already playing Castris with Tribby. If this is the scenario you find yourselves in, it just really depends on what other teams you're playing, and if you need Cyrene in order to have more support options to flex between your teams, or if you'd rather have Tribby E1, which is going to be more flexible for non-Chrysos Heir teams. It also goes without saying that Cyrene is the last part of the team you would invest into. Hyacinth and Evernight are both always a higher priority for your Castris, but if you have those two, or if you plan on getting Evernight on her rerun to complete this team, then Cyrene slots into this team very nicely. The next DPS is Anaxa. None of the other Chrysos Heirs encapsulates the backloaded nature of Cyrene's kit quite as well as Anaxa. Since Cyrene requires the entire first cycle to get her ultimate, Anaxa spends most of the first cycle doing mediocre damage. Then, all of a sudden, as soon as Cyrene gets her ultimate, bam! She can action advance Anaxa back to back to fire off 2 turns of supercharged skills right before the first cycle ends. This is a very strong combo, despite the backloaded nature of it. Furthermore, the synergy between Anaxa and Cyrene is further enhanced when paired with Seridra. Similarly to Mighty, timing Cyrene's buff to line up with Seridra's double skill is very strong. However, this is where the issue of skill ceiling comes into play once again, just like with Castris. While the combo of lining up Cyrene's buff with Seridra is very satisfying for Anaxa, if you mess this up too many times and you fail to get the full usage of Cyrene's buff, then Anaxa's current teams with Sunday start to equalize with the Cyrene teams. Here is the comparison in their performance from my testing. The pairing of Sunday plus Dan Heng was just such a powerful increase for Anaxa, so when we're assuming a team with a sustain, Cyrene already has some steep competition. Despite that competition, Cyrene is comfortably the best in slot for Anaxa. But again, that gap between Cyrene and Sunday can start to equalize if you aren't able to utilize Cyrene's buff with Seridra for Anaxa, aka getting the extra bounce attacks from Cyrene's buff during Seridra's duplicated skill for Anaxa. So just keep that in mind. Additionally, whereas Hyacinth is the definitive best in slot for most Cyrene teams, Anaxa was one of the cases where I found Dan Heng to compete very strongly against Hyacinth instead of being mostly a lesser version of her. So in general, I would recommend Cyrene for Anaxa under the caveat that you also have Seridra, or you're planning on pulling Seridra on her rerun for this team. Then, I want to briefly discuss the Herda here, since part of Cyrene's buff for Anaxa is specifically meant for Herda and other erudition units when Anaxa is paired with them. To keep things short and concise, Tribby is still better, as you can see from this comparison of their performance. Cyrene is definitely usable with Anaxa and Herda, so if you need Tribby in another team, then you can have Cyrene replace her for Herda, but it's obviously not ideal. Maybe a future erudition unit will be able to pair up with Anaxa and Cyrene better, who knows? But for now, I would not pull Cyrene if you're mainly looking to use Anaxa with Herda. She is mostly a buff for main DPS Anaxa, and that's all. Next up, we have Hyslins, aka DOT teams. Hyslins has a similar issue as Cipher, where they inherently want to be tied to another character who isn't a Chrysos Heir. In Hyslins' case, it's Kafka. Therefore, Cyrene's wrap-up time is going to suffer when she's paired with Hyslins and Kafka. Cyrene does technically allow Hyslins to separate from Kafka more comfortably, since Hyslins is now capable of proccing DOTs on her own, and the energy from Cyrene's buffs leads to much more frequent Hyslins ultimates, but Kafka's frequency via her follow-up attacks and everything else in her kit is still unmatched. I don't have a numbers comparison because Cyrene was actually bugged with Hyslins, but from my testing prior to the bug, I can safely say that Cyrene is a side grade to the likes of Black Swan when paired with Hyslins and Kafka. Getting Cyrene's ultimate in the first wave is nigh impossible, so you are oftentimes giving up the ability to zero cycle, just like with the Glaya, but if you're alright with that, and if you know the fight is going to take you an extra cycle or two anyway, then once Cyrene is ramped up, she's going to comfortably compete with the DOT team's other teammate options. To be clear, I would never recommend pulling Cyrene specifically for Hyslins, unless you just really like their characters and want to play them together, in which case, you can make them work perfectly fine together, so that's nice at least. Then we have Finon. There's a lot to say about Finon, and a lot of opinions I've seen thrown around about Finon and Cyrene, so I already made several videos specifically dedicated to Finon and Cyrene. Please refer to those videos for my more in-depth opinions on Finon and Cyrene, as I have already addressed most of the concerns with Finon and Cyrene. To keep things short, Cyrene's value for Finon is the comfort of no longer needing to build core flame stacks for subsequent Finon ultimates, since he'll never leave his ultimate, and she manages to do this without sacrificing any damage compared to Finon's current teams. But just because she's good for Finon doesn't mean she's the most important investment for him. First off, Seridra is always going to be the first thing you pull for Finon. After that, Finon's biggest upgrade is going to be his own E2. Obviously, this is a complicated topic because Finon's E2 requires more pulls compared to just getting an E0 Cyrene, and getting stuck at an E1 Finon just isn't worth it. So if you can only spare enough pulls for one extra 5-star, Cyrene is going to be the better choice. However, if you can and want to eventually go all the way to Finon's E2, then that is by far the best choice for your Finon team if you want to keep playing him into the future. So it's up to you how many pulls you're willing to spend between Finon, Seridra, and Cyrene just to upgrade your Finon team. The last DPS is Evernight. A lot of similar caveats as Castris' section also applies to Evernight. She ideally wants Hyacinth first, and after that, Cyrene is a very good upgrade for her to replace either RMC or Tribby. It should also be noted that Evernight teams make the most out of Cyrene's own personal damage compared to a lot of the other teams due to the full Remembrance team giving her a lot of recollection stacks, as well as the fact that Evernight just gives a ton of team-wide buffs for Remembrance characters. Therefore, even though Cyrene's buff for Evernight isn't the craziest thing in the world, it's the overall team synergy as a whole that makes Cyrene slot in so nicely with Evernight. So we've covered whether Cyrene is worth it or not for each of the Chrysos Heirs, but is she worth it for your overall account? This depends on a few things that only you can answer. First off, some of the Chrysos Heirs have decent alternative options to Cyrene. So if you only have one Chrysos Heir team that you play, meaning Cyrene is going to be stuck with them and only them and can't be flexed to any other teams, then I would say her pull value is rather dubious. However, if you have at least two different Chrysos Heir teams, such as if you have a Mighty team and a Finite team, or if you have a Caster's team and an Anaxa team, then Cyrene gains a lot of value due to allowing you to flex supports between your teams a lot more easily, while also having high value for two different teams on your account. People are worried about Cyrene's future value due to the fact that it's likely we won't be getting any more Chrysos Heirs, so if that's something you're worried about, you should at least make sure her present value is good for your account by having at least two teams that can make use of her. Not that you need two different Chrysos Heir teams to justify using her, of course. People still pull Jiao, even though he's only used with Acheron after all. So if you're only pulling her for one specific team that you just really love, then that's fine. It's just my personal advice to pull her mainly if you have at least two different teams that can make use of her, so that she has a bit of flexibility on your account. Lastly, it comes down to your dedication to whatever team you're pulling her for. The 4.x patches are right around the corner, and with them, we're likely to see a shift in the meta. If you're going to pull for a character like Cyrene, who very likely will not see any use with the upcoming characters, you should make sure you really love and really want to keep using the Chrysos Heir teams on your account. Because if there's a chance you'll just completely abandon them for the 4.x meta anyway, then pulling Cyrene is hard to recommend, you know? The way I view Cyrene is like this. Cyrene is the last puzzle piece of your Chrysos Heir teams, but she is never the first puzzle piece for the team. There is generally always going to be something else that you would rather invest into first for your team, and only after you check those boxes does Cyrene become a worthwhile pull on your team. It's very fitting why they gave her so much puzzle imagery in her trailer now. So again, these are questions only you can answer for your own account. Once you've answered those questions, you can consider pulling Cyrene based on how valuable she is for your specific Chrysos Heir DPS, based on all the points we went through for each of them in this video. Or you can ask in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer. And be sure to like the video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. Cyrene's banner is upon us, so I wanted to make sure you knew what you were getting into before considering spending pulls for her. I do genuinely think Cyrene is very strong for the Chrysos Heirs, and while her kit is the most hyper-specific kit in the game, the fact that she can be an upgrade for most of the Chrysos Heir teams actually gives her a decent amount of team flexibility, assuming you have the characters she's made to synergize with. I would never venture to call her universal or anything of the sort, but she is flexible within her own specific use case. I'll probably release another Cyrene video to briefly discuss how to build her, and then after that, we'll be moving on to the next HSR character. So be sure to subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss out on more content like this. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you, and with that said, until next time!